Well, I've produced a kind of handout. It's just it's more of a picture, except for the actual stats in it. Well, if you look at the present crisis, it's quite evident it's quite different from the crises, at least before 2000. Also, economists tend to simply look at the last 200 years and then compare one with the other, assuming that they're basically all the same. Or the causation is all the same, and therefore decide that if the period from one point in the crisis to another takes so long at one time, and this tends to happen over a number of the periods, that is what will happen now. That is most unlikely. Basically what I'm saying is the present crisis is, as many people have said, very similar, and I'd say in causation, very similar to what happened in the Great Depression, and that in turn can be compared to the long downturn at the end of the 19th century. Engels, if you remember, said the crises are getting more severe. In principle, that is correct, it appears to me. It only didn't look correct because in the period after the war, we didn't have crises in the same way. So insofar as what is now occurring is very different from the previous period from 45, or 40 if you want, down to 2000, it obviously is different. Now, at an empirical level, that's absolutely obvious because the spectacular crash has no precedent in the post-war period. But it is very similar to what happened after 1929. And as various people have pointed out, it is tracking the Great Depression in Britain. It's not tracking it in the United States, but it is tracking the Great Depression in Britain. So that is the basic feature of it. The first point about it, which has made it so different, is the spectacular crash of finance capital. Now, again, one would expect it because this is the period of finance capital. In that sense, it isn't different because in the last 20, 30 years, we've been living under finance capital. But nonetheless, as a crash, the spectacular crash, it is of course different. So the point then is to begin with finance capital. And in the handout I've referred to the statistics which I referred to last time, the incredible figure of $14.5 trillion being held in money form by private banks in the world, which very largely means the West. We only got that figure a month or two ago. It was about $14.5 trillion last year, and it had gone down, that's not the crash, by about 30%. So we're talking about something like $18 trillion. Now you realize what $18 trillion means, obviously, since we've all heard $1 trillion or so, but $18 trillion. And of course, this isn't income as wealth, so one really should compare it to wealth. And if you do, you'll see that the UK, according to the Guardian, on the 4th of August, was worth $7 trillion. So it could easily be bought up by a section of the capitalist class, as it were. Well, the point is the relationship, that it really is an enormous sum. And of course, 18 trillion is 4 trillion more than the US GDP, and it's more than a quarter of world GDP. So you have an enormous section of capital being held in money. I made this point yesterday. The fact that it's being held in money in this form is itself an indication. It's an indication of two things. One is the way in which finance capital has come into being and dominated. The second thing is, the second point, is the phenomenon of surplus capital. That's the concept of surplus capital actually coming into being in this gigantic form. By surplus capital, I mean capital which cannot be invested at a rate of return acceptable to the capitalist class, which therefore is not productively invested and is therefore held in the form of money rather than in terms of productive assets. Now, it's fairly obvious that if you hold this high level of money, it's going to have a skewing effect on the whole system. Obviously, what you're doing is withdrawing money from the world economy. It obviously follows from that you're going to have a relatively low rate of growth in productive assets. That has been the case, in fact, since they switched to finance capital. There was a very short period between 1995 and 2000 when commentators and various people were crowing about a new paradigm. Growth was getting ever higher and would go even higher, and innovation was fantastic, and capitalism had reached this new, wonderful, self-perpetuating paradigm. Obviously, once it crashed in March 2000, the paradigm ended too. It's now, of course, been recalculated, the rate of growth. One of the obvious points that could have been made, has now been made, is that if you start to look at the increase in income, in terms of finance capital itself, it would make sense to cut it down somewhat, since it's proved to be such a mess and the return has been so much lower, if you want to look at it in these terms. So in other words, the calculation has been redone, and we're no longer talking about this period of greater growth. It's not clear there was greater growth. Obviously, in Marx's terms, it didn't exist anyway. So, in fact, in the whole period, from the switch to finance capital from 78, 9 or 75, or whenever you want to date it, down to the present, the rate of growth has been a lot less than it has been, and it had been in the West in the period after the war. Now, that was a deliberate decision to switch to finance capital. You'd expect that if you do go to finance capital, that would happen, and that has happened. I'll go back to what that actually means and why they actually did that. The point of getting to is why on earth you have this $14.5 trillion being held in banks rather than being invested. Well, clearly, if you're shifting out of productive assets, you have to invest and you have to put it somewhere. And in this period, as the shift continued, the opportunity to put it into productive assets declined. On the other hand, given the shift in control, and given the control over the working classes which went with it, which we'll come back to, there was a clear shift in the distribution of income. Now, I think we all know that. The fact is that the relationship between profits and wages has never been so wide since the war, which is a point I made yesterday. Now, it's fairly obvious that under those circumstances you're going to have huge sums which require to be invested. And if the productive sector is not being expanded, then there's a problem as to where to invest it. The result was, right from the beginning, that you started to get a massive rise in asset prices. There wasn't an inflation in consumer goods prices. The exact reverse occurred, as we know. But there was a huge rise in asset prices. And it was all assets. Obviously, everybody knows the rise in house prices, but it applied to everything else, which the capitalist class could put its money into, like pictures, commercial property. Now, that was its logic. Of course, if one looks back at it, it simply looks decadent. You can't say anything else about it. The usual way of looking at it in the papers, or by much of the left for that matter, has been to talk a lot of bubbles. But there is no bubble really involved. You've got an automatic process occurring in which asset prices simply have to go up under these circumstances. It's still there. Until the finance capitalists were wiped out, until this $14 trillion is dealt with, it's got to go somewhere. So you're going to have this pressure for asset prices to go up because there's nowhere else that it can go. So in that sense, there is a permanent bubble, if you want. But it doesn't make very much sense to talk about bubble, really. What you've got is permanent pressure for asset prices to rise right across the range. And quite clearly, it'll go into those assets which the investors expect to rise most quickly and which they regard as safest. What they're not going to do is to invest, say, in the Congo, in Latiff's favorite town there, Lubumbashi, in some street there, and buy a house. Obviously, only an idiot would do that. They aren't that kind of idiot. So you'd be talking particularly of London, actually, which is why house prices in Kensington go up so much, and are going up so much now. So we're talking about this huge agglomeration. Now the next step is, well, okay, going into asset prices that keep going up, but there's a limited number of assets, and it just becomes speculative and insecure to keep doing that. So they were looking for somewhere else. Effectively, they were speculating on productive industry to a large degree, ruining it, in fact, insofar as they went into it. They therefore, not having anywhere else, as it were, went into finance itself. What went along with this, if you remember, is this absurd ideology that money makes money. I say this because the British government certainly bought it. The idea that Britain itself could live off finance capital. Finance was as productive as a car factory. The consequence was, of course, that the banks competed with each other, and various financial institutions, hedge funds, private equity, or whatever it is, competed with each other to get the highest possible returns. They needed to do that because they wouldn't get the money otherwise. If they were regarded as getting lower profits, and certainly if they were regarded as insecure, they wouldn't get the money. So they competed with each other in order to get higher returns and in order to get the money itself. The fault, therefore, as it were, didn't lie with the subprime mortgagees. It didn't lie with the house owners, which is the way it's put. If you look at reasons given for causation, one reason is greed, so-called, and that's why you get the Archbishop of Canterbury complaining. This obviously is illiterate. Quite apart from the absurdity of blaming people themselves for getting into debt. It wasn't they who were demanding the mortgages, it was the other way around. There was a huge amount of money which the banks simply had to find a way of getting a higher return. So they virtually forced these mortgages on people and needed to do it. This was particularly true of the United States, of course, where everything began. But it was the case that the big banks went out to people and virtually forced them to get mortgages. The entire fault, therefore, lies on the banking system. But going back to it, it lies on the capitalist system itself, in a period of decline and decadence. Not that anybody could have predicted that it would reach this totally absurd position, because that is what it is. The logic, of course, was that the individuals within the banks were therefore competing with each other in order to get higher returns, in order to get bonuses, or just to keep their jobs. But they were being forced to do it because of this pile of money which simply had to be dealt with. The logic, therefore, was that it would continue until it would crash. There was nothing else that could happen. It couldn't be called off. It didn't really make any difference whether Greenspan raised the rate of interest or didn't. If they had raised the rate of interest or crashed a bit earlier, possibly. It maybe would have, I doubt it. Greenspan has kind of confessed, but it's a bit like a KGB confession, really, that he's going in for, because he really couldn't do anything else but confess after they turned on him. But the fact is, if you actually look at it, he really had no alternative but to keep the interest low all through this period. Because he knew that if you raised the rate of interest, the system would become more unstable than it was. And there's a real danger that it would actually crash. And almost certainly it would have crashed. Why was this? Well, that goes back to the history of it. The history was that when this Cold War came to an end, obviously it's not a coincidence, which was in the late 80s, you had actually two things happen. The Cold War was coming to an end, but also you had this situation that because the Cold War was coming to an end, there was no need to extend the investment in war goods. I've given statistics before, but in 1986, the United States reached its highest level of percentage of GDP going into the military in a non-war period since 1970, as it were, or since 1960. So it's by 1986, Reagan had gone for massive investment in military industry, precisely because there was a downturn. Now, the downturn didn't just happen spontaneously. Volcker, the Federal Reserve governor, raised interest rates and it went right down. And Reagan responded with this fiscal stimulus. Rather odd way of going about things, but that's what actually happened. And it was justified under the name of a squeeze. So by 1989, that had come to an end. That's to say, the Cold War was coming to an end, and the squeeze itself was coming to an end, and extra expenditure was coming to an end, and of course, you had a sudden downturn. It wasn't so sudden since the stock market had crashed for the first time since the war in '87, and it really crashed. But the government immediately stepped in and stopped it. What's interesting is the way it was able to stop it then, and couldn't this time. Anyway, the point is that lasted until about '93. Japan has never recovered. It's still in that depression effectively. It's gone up and down. It is effectively still in deflation, although it's been out of it, it's gone back into it. Sweden, as you know, was caught. The United States began to come out under Clinton, but it was pretty shaky. And it was so obviously shaky, there's no way that Greenspan was going to do anything else, the Federal Reserve governor. They couldn't reflate in that kind of way. Sorry, deflate in that kind of way. They couldn't raise the interest rate. So they didn't. In other words, the attempt to try and control the asset inflation, which was now going on at a fairly high rate, just couldn't be mounted. It was an objective fact. It wasn't that he got it wrong. He just couldn't do anything else. So in this period, you have the forms which have today taken the particular aspect of what amounts to a depression, take the different forms of so-called bubbles in East Asia, Russia, and so forth. Just to say, because there was a surplus capital, because they exhausted simply raising asset prices, they put money into Malaysia, etc., etc. And these countries, South Korea, and these countries effectively crash. The same thing happened with Russia. Then you had the long-term capital management fund crash, and the dot-com crash. Money had simply been going into each one of these things, and they exploded, which was fairly obvious that it would happen, but it happened. The downturn then of March 2000 was a real downturn. And the only way they actually got out of it to any reasonable degree was partly the war on terror in 2001, partly the Iraq war that I mentioned before, but the Iraq war led to a doubling of war expenditure. Nonetheless, the rate of growth was the lowest upturn that they'd had since the war. So in reality, the present downturn should be really regarded at one level as a continuation of the downturn of March 2000. It is very much that. It's something that in this period, because they were in this downturn, it was even more difficult for capital to find areas of investment. So you have this spectacular rise in derivatives. I think I've been giving this talk, what is it, 5, 6, 7 years, something. And I can remember that talking of $200 trillion in derivatives. I think it was in 2001 when I spoke there. And of course, by 2007, it had reached $596 trillion.
So how many times is that the world's GDP?
It's 10 times. 10 or 12 times, depending on how you count it. World GDP roughly 54 to 60 trillion. That's $596 trillion in derivatives. The base of it is 14 trillion, which is very similar to the figure that I began with, in other words. It goes back to this, what amounts to excess money, if you want to call it that, the surplus capital. Obviously, it doesn't all go back to it, but it's not an accident that the figure isn't that different. So the base of the $596 trillion is officially, I didn't add up any figures to get this, I just get these figures from the Bank of International Settlements, which you can look up on the net if you feel like it. The figure, of course, has gone down, as you would expect, since the end of 2007. Just as the figure of what was 18 trillion in banks has gone down to 14 trillion. Anyway, the point is that they went in for the banks then started to invent these arcane forms of giving loans to each other, which is what it boils down to. Going from one to another. If you remember, the mortgages that were taken out in America were sold by the particular bank which gave the mortgage in the so-called package, let's say, together with another loan. It was then sold to another bank or another finance house of some kind or other, which in turn resold it and so on and so on, which is the way the whole thing worked. Well, you don't have to be a genius to work out that that will crash. It's obvious it must crash because you simply can't have an interrelationship of debt of that kind which will not crash. In principle, if everybody pays up in time and the loans are all correct at all times, and there's therefore an equilibrium among all the loans, then that's fine. But to believe that that would be the case, you really have to belong to one of the idiots groups on the left, I think. That would be the only way you really dream of it staying like that. And some of you might remember the debate I had on that, where I think the other guy actually claimed I was deceiving everybody by talking of this figure, as if it meant nothing. Well, of course, it's been spectacularly disproved. So the point is then that what happened with capital was that it turned in on itself. Finance capital turned in on itself, became cannibalistic. Obviously, it would crash. You would have to be really, let's say, turned mad by something in order to believe that it wouldn't crash. But in fact, the question then is, what underlies all that? And I think I've already been giving the basis of it, or have given the basis of it. It's very hard to talk about it being simply a falling rate of profit, given the fact that profits, in fact, are so far up. you really have to, I think, indulge in some sort of arcane recalculation of statistics on a dubious basis in order to come to the viewpoint that therefore there's formula rate of profit actually involved there. Of course, it's possible it's burrowing its way underneath, but it's very hard to actually discover that. And no doubt it has been operating in some way or other, but it's hard to see what it is. It's quite clear that the immediate form of a crash is underconsumption. That's immediate. Well, this doesn't mean to say it's the overall form. But the immediate form is clearly that. If the trigger was that of subprime mortgages, the immediate form is underconsumptionist. Now that isn't surprising, because what you've got is a situation, just think about it, where the surplus value, which would otherwise flow into productive assets in order to produce more productive assets, or in order to produce goods, which in turn would produce consumer goods and so forth, isn't flowing there. It just isn't going into the producer goods. It just isn't doing it. It's standing static. Under those circumstances, there is bound to be a disparity between the surplus value which exists and the possibility of buying goods. That's an automatic consequence. It's a result of the existence of surplus capital. Now, in other words, the phenomenal form that we're talking about here is underconsumption. The underlying form is the existence of surplus capital, which is what we have to understand. Why is there this surplus capital? Well, that goes back again to the reason why they switched to finance capital. The finance capital, to repeat, I say repeat because I think I get the feeling that every time I speak here, I have to define it and fight for the concept itself. Remember, finance capital is originally defined by Hillel, I think, quite correctly, as abstract capital. Let's say it's abstracted from its location, even time and place, as opposed to productive capital, which exists in a particular time and place and has to do so. Workers, therefore, are confined to time and place. Finance capital is not. It's automatically global. Money, you remember, is defined by Marx as world money, otherwise it is not money. Or rather, that's one of the aspects of the definition of money. So to the extent to which it is not world money, it is less than money. So it automatically would follow that finance capital as world has to be world money, and it is world money. It is the real form of globalization. It can be shifted from one point to another, as we know, not even the drop of a hat. It's shifted electronically even faster than you could drop your hat. So it is, wherever it is global. So in the first instance, it is abstract capital. And the second point about it is, of course, one of its immediate features is its short-termist nature. Its demand for an immediate return. And in this respect, Britain is the British economy has been the finance capitalist capital of the world for a very long time. It was Britain really which switched to finance capital. Now that's not what Hillel and Lenin said, but that does seem to me to be true. It's 15 minutes. Oh,
yeah, 15 to go. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. So finance capital is necessarily short-termist. Because it's short-termist, it tends to be destructive. It can't simply go into productive assets, because today most productive assets take a long time to give a return. Productive assets require, modern productive assets of any scale require long research times. They require long development times. So it prefers not to go into that part of industry, or into industry for that matter. It simply wants to get a return as quickly as possible. So it would be necessarily destructive, and that's the way it actually operates. The most destructive form of it recently has been private equity, which deliberately goes out of its way to get an immediate return and put together whatever firms it can put together, buy it, break it up, sell it off, close it down, close what can be closed down, and sell off the rest. The result is real destruction of what they've actually built. Of course, in part, it does invest in industry as it has invested to a degree in other countries. But again, it's a distorted form of it. And although it's not short-term in the sense that it may be for 5 or 10 years, it's short-term is still the same in a more general sense, that they're only investing to get a rapid return, or the most rapid return, the best return they can get. And they're not really interested in keeping the industry going. As soon as they've got a reasonable return wherever they are, they will clear out. So, finance capital, therefore, has a characteristic of being abstract capital. It has a characteristic of being necessarily short-termist. And as I say, really the short-termist capital in the world is London, which is demonstrated by its banks. If you go to a bank here, you get at most an 18-month loan. You go to Germany, the tradition has been 22 years. It's, in spite of the fact that Lennon and Hilferding talk of the banks and finance capital being primarily in Germany, I think they actually got it wrong. Well, that is a separate question, as to whether they got it right or wrong. The point then is that the world shifted towards finance capital, and finance capital is above all Anglo-American capital. Or you should just call it American capital, because Britain in this case is a branch of the United States, even if London, the London Stock Exchange, overtook that of New York, because if you look at who's actually in the stock exchange, they are American first. So it's Anglo-American capital in the first instance, which is dominant. Not that there wasn't capital elsewhere, quite obviously there was. But Anglo-American capital, finance capital in the form of Anglo-American capital, was actually dominant. The third feature of finance capital is that it's not necessarily dominant, otherwise it isn't finance capital. Let's say it dominates the economy itself. I think it's fairly obvious in the case of Britain and the United States. It's finance capital which rules, rather than industrial capital. There's a constant fight between them, but nonetheless, it's finance capital which actually rules. Well, it was for that reason that the form of this downturn has been the finance capitalist form. It had to be that. And what I've said with the two is that what it appears to be the case is that there seems to be only one finance capitalist power effectively in the world, which is dominant. The other countries are subordinate. Before the United States, it was Britain. And there was no country which could actually compete with it, even if it had 2 world wars to prove it. The fact was, of course, it had the world wars when it was in decline. However, in the earlier period, Britain was dominant, and it was dominant as a finance capitalist power. So, what follows from that is that any downturn in the world economy would have to begin in the United States. Now, I'm saying this because I've been asked in one of these meetings, why the United States, why they concentrate in the United States. I'm answering the question. The world is dependent on the United States. The United States rules. It doesn't just rule militarily, it rules through finance capital. It is the dominant imperial power. No country can contest it. The idea that there'd be an imperialist war is just crazy. Of course, it's in decline. You could argue in 20 years it might be different. Finance capital is in decline, the United States is in decline. So if you look at where the decline is, you look at the United States. If capitalism is in decline, the United States must be in decline. So you look at the United States. If you want to analyze the nature of capitalism, you have to look at the United States in the first instance. The idea that you would then turn to China and see that as the future belongs to third worldists or dreamers or something. But Martin Jakes, exactly. It is the United States that we have to actually look at. Okay, then the question is, why did they turn to finance capital? What actually happened? Well, in that instance, we referred to it last time, and it was referred to particularly by Mike here, who referred to the discussions of the 70s. In my view, what actually happened was that the ruling class realized they couldn't continue in the old way, they couldn't have full employment, couldn't have workers being emboldened by full employment and steady wages. They simply had to break that. That in effect, we're in the consequences of the revolts from 1968 to 75 or whichever date you want. The ruling class decided that enough was enough. They couldn't continue with the Cold War with the post-war settlement after World War II, with the welfare state, full employment, military Keynesianism, which is what it was. They might have continued the military, but they didn't be Keynesian. Consequently, they switched to finance capital. I think it's a conscious strategy. It's not something which has happened by accident. It's not something that has been pushed to by falling rate of profit. Even in Britain, the rate of profit was low. That was true of Britain. In the United States, the profit wasn't that low. They didn't have to move in that way, but they did. And I think it was this consequence that of 1968, of the working class revolting or acting, that they reckoned they would have to switch the mode of control. And they did switch the mode of control, and switched to finance capital, and was highly successful. The policy which has been followed, which is that of neo-liberalism, so-called, is a policy of finance capital. I don't use the term neo-liberal. It implies that it comes out of nowhere, it's an independent policy. It's not. It's simply the policy of finance capital. That's all. So the political policy of finance, the political economic policy of finance capital. Okay, so that is how or why I understand there has been a shift. What's therefore happened, why this is different, is this is an explosion of finance capital. Finance capital can't recover from it. It has happened. How is it going to recover? It can't. Doesn't mean to say it ceased to exist. It will continue to operate, but it is now in crisis and in decline in this crisis. This is where it is. That means its policy is in trouble. And that's obvious because they've now changed, they're trying to change their policy somehow, find an alternative. Well, the question then, because I can't cover everything, I haven't gone very far in the crisis itself, I have to say. But I'll then raise a question with that. Does the ruling class have an alternative strategy? I don't think it does. Well, we can now, and we'll talk about it in more detail since I've got about 4 minutes next time. But the strategy being pursued at the moment is a strategy of no strategy. It's a strategy of muddling through. In other words, they don't know what to do, so they've adopted a limited Keynesian strategy in order to get out of it, but they haven't adopted a strategy for the future. Since the previous one, the finance capital strategy has now failed, it just can't be applied. What are they going to do for the future? Well, muddle seems to be the policy, but it's not a real policy. They have to have something else. And so what we'll talk about next time, so I won't go into this any further, is the apparent line being put forward by the Conservatives and by the Republicans, which is that of disciplining the working class, just using this period to discipline the working class. That's, of course, what Peter drew out of me in the interview, that they will now go for a period of discipline. We'll talk about that next time. As to whether that is a real strategy or whether it really is possible. Having said that, turn very briefly back to the crisis itself. How long will it last? What will actually happen, and so on. And obviously, I can't know in detail because nobody knows, but it's quite apparent. It's much deeper than what they say. The so-called green shoots don't really exist. What you've got is a massive rise in the stock exchange, but it's not followed by anything else. And you have to remember that because of private equity, precisely because of finance capital, the actual number of shares on the stock exchange has been limited in the past few years. In other words, they've been bought up. Many firms have been turned private. Other firms have gone bankrupt. So it's quite easy it's easier for the stock exchange to rise quickly in this period. It's easier than it would have been 10 years ago, as it were. It's still, of course, far from its peak, but nonetheless, it has been this rise. But if you look at the other indicators, they just aren't there. Of course, the only decent newspaper in this country is the Financial Times, and that's more or less what it's saying. They've been talking about green shoots now for about 6 months, I think. But they are still green shoots. They haven't matured or anything, so they remain green shoots. There was a very good article a couple of months ago, or 7 weeks ago, by Wolfgang Muncher from Germany, where he goes through this point and he just nails it, point after point, showing that really there is no basis for talking of any real upturn in the real economy. Well, again, that is fairly obvious. The question we then have to ask is why the stock exchange is rising, or why they're talking about green shoots. Well, if you look at the Great Depression, they did exactly the same thing. The newspapers, every few days, would say, we're coming out of the Depression. So for 10 years, they were always coming out of the Depression. That was the nature of the reporting in the papers then, and that's the nature of the reporting of the papers now. So that's one of the aspects of it. But there's a more substantial aspect of it. Amazing, because I didn't actually realize it. It does seem as if the bourgeoisie did think the system was finished. It does seem, from what I understand, that they actually did think in September, October 2008, the system was about to go down. Now, there was a real possibility of the meltdown of the monetary system, but I don't think that would have lasted. It would have been a meltdown, and they would have tried to put the thing together. It would have been a clear indication of the nature of what capitalism is and so on, but I think they would have been able to put it together again. But they were really scared the system was down. In one of the articles I wrote, I give, it's in the notes to critique, I give a number of quotes from various people in authoritative positions in banks who are actually saying that. So they thought the system was finished. As I say, it's amazing for anybody on the left, since we know the working class isn't acting now. We know it can't be overthrown right at this point. Since it didn't go down, and it is relatively stable, and because they have relatively stabilized, they have stabilized to a degree the monetary system, they are now overjoyed. Things now are kind of back to normal as far as they're concerned. So it makes sense for the stock exchange to go up and for them to talk of green shoots. The banks are not going bankrupt. Just, well, a lot of banks are going bankrupt in the United States in various regions, but that's unimportant. They're small banks and they're able to take care of them. They've nationalised enough banks, like HBOS, Royal Bank, Scotland, and of course Citibank. Citibank and RBS, I think, would have been the two top banks in the world. So that's the reason for the relative stability. The fact that the banks haven't gone down is still a huge pile of so-called toxic debt, which hasn't been dealt with, which they know. I don't know whether they can actually deal with it. I think they probably could actually deal with it. I think that respect, the financial crisis, is now secondary. What's now important is the industrial crisis, the fact that firms are closing, that people are being sacked on a large scale, and that is continuing, that wages are going down. It obviously follows from that that the crisis will itself build up. If you want to put a formula that one would be talking about, since they tend to look at this as to whether it is a square root or inverted square root or a V or a W, I have to say it would be a W. Let's say we're going to go back down again, not in the banks, but because we're really in a genuine crisis similar to 1929, it will go down again. Now, nobody among the official economists actually thinks there's going to be a boom. Almost certainly there'll be an upturn, but the upturn will be very weak. And in fact, there'll be an upturn where you could argue that it is only a technical upturn, or that it's an upturn which isn't an upturn, or whatever you want to say. In other words, we're in a period very similar to the Great Depression or to the period of the last quarter of the 19th century, when you have relative stagnation. That doesn't say there won't be any innovation, productivity won't rise, or whatever, but it does mean a low rate of growth. Okay, thank you.